What do you make of Donald Trump's criticisms of NATO overall?
Well, firstly, let's be absolutely clear. NATO is a defensive alliance. It is not an extension of the US military for Donald Trump to issue orders to in order to compensate for his lack of competency or planning over his Iran war. Where there has been an immediate threat to NATO members resulting from the Iran war, NATO defense operations have been activated. We saw that several times in Turkey when NATO defense batteries intercepted Iranian ballistic missiles. And so NATO members have been in keeping with their treaty obligations and are under no further legal duty to do anything else for Donald Trump. There's really no clear legal case for anything else other than that, really. There has really been an astonishing amount of Western diplomatic resources, both in Trump's first term and now in his second term, that have gone into trying to make sure that he doesn't do what he seems to be doing right now, and that is to withdraw from NATO. I suspect this is a deliberate trap that Trump has actually set for NATO, where he has taken action against Iran without any consultation from NATO members or European allies. He then unreasonably demands support from NATO to help himself, which of course he knows he will not receive, and therefore he acts like the victim. I think frankly it's an act of treachery against the West, considering that NATO has been the bedrock of Western stability for almost 80 years, and it's actually a betrayal of European and Canadian allies who lost thousands of soldiers defending the United States in the only time that Article 5 under the NATO treaty has ever been activated after 9/11.
So what is it then that NATO members fear the most in terms of offering support to US-Israeli war on Iran?
I think there are a number of reasons why they're very hesitant to get involved. I think firstly, they want to uphold international law in an era when it seems to be fragmenting. I think the legal case for the Iran war has actually been incredibly weak. The US justification seems to range from a kind of contrived threat of an immediate construction of an Iranian nuclear weapon to really the blatant imperial oil grab, really depending on what day of the week it is. Secondly, I think European nations are deeply scarred from their experience of participating in the Iraq war. They simply don't want a repeat of collapsing a regime and not knowing how to put it back together again, because actually that was hugely costly in terms of lives, but also just in terms of Western diplomatic capital. And I think thirdly, they are deeply concerned about the consequences of kind of any involvement whatsoever with the US war in Iran, just due to the fact that actually they suffered terrorist attacks in result of their participation in the Iraq war. Of course, particularly Spain, which has been the most vocal opponent of Trump's war in Iran from a European perspective, suffered a terrorist incident in Madrid in 2004. Of course, we saw terrorist bombings in London as well. So I think really they know that any kind of involvement, even the use of airspace, will ultimately be viewed by Iran as actually participation in this. I think ultimately it's a very, very difficult thing, a very difficult position for European nations to be in at the moment, because they don't want to be participating in the war, but ultimately they know that actually there are very serious consequences that result from the Iran war being a bit of a mess, particularly with the Strait of Hormuz remaining shut. So I think they are in a very difficult position to not wanting to be associated with the war, but also trying to manage some of the very serious consequences for it as well.
Right, you say a very difficult position there. I mean, can NATO survive without America in military and in terms of resources?
Well, I think it really depends on what we mean by NATO without the United States. I think American law is very clear. The US president does not have the legal authority to unilaterally withdraw from NATO without congressional approval. And I think he is certainly not going to get congressional approval for doing so. But he certainly said that in the last week that he wouldn't come to the defense of NATO allies as he would be required to do under the NATO treaty. And that does effectively render US involvement in NATO redundant or obsolete, even though it's technically still a member. Now, I think NATO members, Europe and Canada, will try to continue over the next few years in the hope that actually the next president will recommit to being part of NATO again. But I think it's going to be particularly difficult if we see Trump follow through on his words and actually starts to withdraw from NATO operationally. So, for example, if he withdraws the 80,000 US soldiers in Europe, I think that'd be very difficult for Europe to deal with, because that would create huge defensive gaps, both on the ground, but also in terms of air cover as well. So I think really we are going to see a changing relationship. I think ultimately NATO can survive without the United States, but certainly Europe will have to become the new anchor for it. They'll have to spend far more amounts of public money on defense, which of course be very difficult for Western publics to accept. It may have to introduce conscription in certain countries, as some countries like Germany have already alluded to. I think we'll also have to see other sort of movements in Europe, like becoming much more defence integrated, which actually will cause more cost savings for Europe overall. So I think we are certainly in an era of change. I think Europe hasn't completely given up on the hope that long-term America will still be part of NATO, but ultimately Europe knows that it cannot completely rely on the United States anymore, and it's going to have to take major steps to compensate for that.